That's what they're doing with their resources. You look at Asia Wilson's signature shoe, her logo, resources wasted. You look at the Paige Bueckers Nike logo. Does this look like they really wanted to do this, or they were just catering to that crowd? So they said, oh, let's just get up Paige and let's give her a logo. Let's cater to the crowd. It's a company I grew up with. I think many of us had these. Paige Bueckers signs a deal with Lego as she prepares to be the next signature athlete. Now, my question to you: how many kids know who Paige Bueckers is? Number one. How many kids' parents know who Paige Bueckers is? Number two. And if you're walking in a toy store, whether it's Target, whether it's a toy section at Walmart, and you see this face on a box, who knows who this is?
It looks bold, it looks progressive, and on the surface, it looks like a smart investment. But what if some of the biggest brands in sports marketing right now aren't building momentum, they're trying to fake it? Because over the past few months, something strange has been happening behind the scenes in women's basketball. Something subtle enough to slip past casual fans, but obvious once you know where to look. And when you finally notice it, the whole strategy starts to feel a lot less confident than the press releases would have you believe. Here's the uncomfortable reality no one wants to say out loud. Major corporations are spending millions of dollars trying to manufacture excitement where the market hasn't fully shown up yet. Not nurture it, not grow it organically, force it. And the way they're doing it has left behind a trail of clues that fans immediately picked up on. Clues that suggest these companies might be chasing a narrative instead of following demand. Because when brands are truly confident in a star, they don't borrow identity, they don't recycle symbolism, and they definitely don't quietly lean on someone else's legacy to make their campaign land. But that's exactly what sparked the backlash this time. A rollout meant to look celebratory ended up raising eyebrows, not applause. And the reason wasn't the athlete involved, it was what the marketing revealed about the people writing the checks. At first glance, everything seemed perfectly timed. New partnerships, new logos, big announcements stacked on top of each other, all signaling that the next face of women's basketball had arrived. But almost immediately, fans started asking the same question in comment sections and group chats. Who is this actually for? Because the visuals, the colors, the framing, it all felt familiar in a way that didn't quite add up. Familiar enough to grab attention, but not authentic enough to ignore. And that's where this story really begins. Not with stats, not with highlights, but with a design choice that accidentally exposed a much bigger problem. One that suggests some brands aren't betting on momentum, they're trying to borrow it. And once you see how deep that goes, it changes the way you look at every historic announcement that came after. Because this isn't just about marketing missteps, it's about how narratives get built, who benefits from them, and what happens when corporations decide optics matter more than outcomes. And what comes next might explain why the numbers keep telling a very different story than the headlines. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. On paper, everything about the announcement felt airtight. Big-name brands stepping into women's basketball, carefully timed rollouts, clean graphics, confident language. It was the kind of moment marketing teams love to point to as proof they're ahead of the curve. A rising star, major corporate backing, and a narrative that practically wrote itself. If you only skimmed the headlines, you'd assume this was exactly what progress looks like. The centerpiece of that moment revolved around Paige Bueckers, an athlete brands have clearly earmarked as a long-term investment. One announcement blurred into the next, a partnership here, a signature element there, Nike unveiling a personal logo, Lego stepping into the picture with a crossover no one had on their bingo card. To executives, it likely looked like momentum stacking on momentum, visibility multiplying visibility. And at first, that's exactly how it played. Sports media amplified it instantly, social feeds filled up with reposts and reaction clips. The language was polished, optimistic, forward-looking. This was framed as the next phase of women's basketball entering the mainstream, with brands signaling long-term belief rather than short-term hype. From the outside, there was no reason to question it. But fans did, almost immediately. Because the moment people stopped reading the captions and actually looked at the visuals, something felt off. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously broken, just misaligned. The kind of thing you don't notice in a rush, but can't ignore once your brain flags it. The designs were clean, but they didn't feel specific. The branding was bold, but oddly familiar, and the more people stared at it, the more that familiarity started to raise questions instead of excitement. Online conversations shifted fast. Instead of celebrating the partnerships, fans began dissecting them. Screenshots circulated, comparisons popped up, and suddenly what was supposed to be a smooth, confident rollout turned into a quiet but persistent side-eye from the very audience these campaigns were meant to attract. Not because anyone doubted the athlete's talent, but because the branding itself was sending mixed signals. That's what made this moment so revealing. Truly confident marketing doesn't spark confusion, it reinforces identity. It makes you immediately understand who this is for and why it exists. But here, people weren't nodding along, they were asking questions. And when consumers start doing that, it's usually because the story being sold doesn't fully match what they're seeing. And this wasn't outrage, it was curiosity, the kind that spreads faster than praise. Because once fans began pulling at that thread, they realized this announcement wasn't as straightforward as it first appeared. And the deeper they looked, the clearer it became that something important was being quietly avoided.
And the next detail they noticed is what really set the conversation on fire. It wasn't a quote, it wasn't a stat, it wasn't even a logo at first. It was the colors. Quiet, subtle, but instantly recognizable to anyone who's been paying attention over the last few years. As screenshots of the promotional material spread, fans noticed something that didn't line up with what they were being told. The visuals weren't matching the identity of the athlete being promoted. And once that realization clicked, the conversation shifted almost overnight. Here's where the whispers started. The color palette being used didn't reflect the athlete's current team. It didn't reflect her college program either. Instead, it echoed the black and gold look fans had seen dominate screens, arenas, and merchandise during one of the most visible runs in women's college basketball history. Colors synonymous with the Iowa Hawkeyes. That immediately raised eyebrows because Paige Bueckers has never played for Iowa. Her college identity was built at UConn Huskies, a program known for an entirely different visual brand. And as she transitions into the pros, she's tied to the Dallas Wings, whose colors are, again, unmistakably different. So why did this look feel so familiar? That's the question fans couldn't stop asking. Comment sections started filling up with side-by-side comparisons. People weren't accusing anyone outright, but the implication was clear. It felt like brands were borrowing a visual shorthand that casual fans already associate with popularity, sold-out arenas, and massive ratings. And while no company ever said that out loud, the timing made the speculation unavoidable. This wasn't years ago. This was happening after one specific player's college run had reshaped attention, viewership, and merchandise sales across the sport. To be clear, none of this was framed as confirmed intent. Most fans were careful with their language. It's been said that, people are pointing out, rumors suggest, this wasn't accidental. The discussion lived firmly in the realm of observation and pattern recognition, but once enough people notice the same pattern, it becomes a conversation whether brands wanted to or not, especially when the visual choices don't logically align with team identity or geography. What made the chatter grow louder wasn't just the color choice itself, it was what that choice implied. Because colors aren't random in marketing, they're one of the fastest ways to trigger recognition, emotion, and memory. Brands guard them carefully, they test them endlessly. So when companies worth billions lean into a palette that doesn't belong to the athlete on the poster, fans naturally start asking whether this was about creativity or association. And that's where the speculation really gained traction. Some fans suggested the brands weren't trying to disrespect anyone, but they were trying to tap into a proven visual cue that already connects with casual audiences. A shortcut, a familiarity hack, something that could make a new campaign feel instantly important without needing time to build that recognition organically. Whether intentional or not, the effect was the same. The spotlight subtly drifted towards someone else's legacy. Once that idea took hold, people started looking backward instead of just forward. They began revisiting past coverage, past matchups, past storylines. And when they did, a pattern started to emerge that made this color choice feel less like a one-off and more like part of a larger narrative that never really went away. And that's when the rivalry framing came back into focus. Long before colors became the focal point, the groundwork had already been laid by a storyline that refused to fade. The moment Paige Bueckers and Caitlin Clark were both dominating college basketball in different ways, the comparison machine kicked into overdrive. Media outlets didn't just highlight their games, they framed entire seasons around the idea that these two were inseparable chapters of the same story. Different styles, different paths, but forever linked by the promise of a rivalry fans were told to invest in. At first, that framing made sense. Two elite players, two powerhouse programs, plenty of high-stakes matchups. But as time went on, the balance shifted. Injuries limited Bueckers during key stretches, and Clark's visibility exploded in real time. Ratings surged, attendance ballooned. Moments turned into viral clips almost nightly. Instead of adjusting the narrative to reflect that divergence, coverage doubled down on the what if. What if injuries hadn't interfered? What if circumstances were different? What if the rivalry was still perfectly even?
That question became the bridge media leaned on whenever the gap became too obvious to ignore. Reports and commentary often suggested that Bueckers was the player who would have matched Clark's impact under the right conditions. And while that kind of framing sounded fair on the surface, it quietly positioned her brand in relation to someone else's momentum, rather than allowing it to stand on its own. It kept the comparison alive, even when real-world outcomes were pulling them in different directions. As seasons passed, the narrative followed them anyway. Every matchup between Iowa and UConn Huskies was hyped as a continuation of something unfinished. Every preview circled back to their names, even when the surrounding circumstances didn't call for it. And fans noticed. Some leaned into it. Others began asking why this particular comparison was being preserved so aggressively, while other standout players were treated as separate stories entirely. That's where speculation began to creep in. Not accusations, observations. People started suggesting that the rivalry framing had become a safety net for coverage and marketing alike, a familiar hook, a reliable shortcut to attention. If Clark's numbers were driving the conversation, then proximity to that conversation still carried value. Whether anyone planned it that way or not, the effect was clear. Bueckers' public perception was often filtered through a lens that had little to do with her current situation. And this didn't fade when college careers ended. If anything, it followed them into the professional transition. Fans online pointed out how often branding, commentary, and promotional efforts still found subtle ways to keep the two names connected, even as their paths clearly diverged. It wasn't loud, it wasn't stated outright, but it was persistent enough to feel intentional to some observers. That persistence is what makes the color choice controversy land harder. Because once fans recognized how long the comparison had been kept alive, the branding decisions didn't feel random anymore. They felt like another chapter in a story that refused to let either athlete exist without the other, especially when one of them had already proven she could command attention all on her own. And eventually, curiosity turned into something harder to ignore. Because narratives are one thing, but numbers don't care about framing. And when people finally started laying those numbers side by side, the conversation shifted in a way no marketing team could smooth over. Narratives can stretch a long way, but they stop working the moment real numbers walk into the room. And once fans began shifting their focus away from branding choices and toward measurable outcomes, the tone of the conversation changed fast. Because opinions are flexible, storylines can be adjusted, but viewership, sales, and attendance don't bend to vibes or vision statements. The turning point came with the professional debut moments everyone had been waiting for. For Paige Bueckers, this was supposed to be the payoff. Years of anticipation, years of marketing buildup, a chance to finally demonstrate that the excitement surrounding her brand translated at the next level. Her debut game aired on ION Television, a platform with limited reach compared to major sports networks. The broadcast averaged just over 600,000 viewers. Not a disaster on its own, but context matters, and fans were quick to add it.
Because when Caitlin Clark made her debut, the contrast was impossible to miss. Her game aired on ESPN, a network that clearly believed her arrival was must-see television. That broadcast drew more than 2 million viewers, nearly 3 times the audience. Same league, same rookie moment, completely different gravitational pull. And unlike debates about style or hype, this gap was measurable, public, and impossible to spin. This is where fans stopped speculating and started comparing. Not to diminish one player, but to question the decision-making above them. Why was one debut treated as a marquee event while the other landed on a channel many casual fans didn't even know existed? Why was corporate marketing screaming generational star while distribution choices suggested something much more cautious? People weren't angry, they were confused, and confusion is a problem brands rarely anticipate. The numbers didn't stop there. Attendance followed the same pattern. Games featuring Clark consistently spiked ticket demand. Road arenas filled up when she was on the schedule. Meanwhile, teams tied to other heavily marketed players struggled to sell out even smaller venues unless Clark was involved. That's not interpretation, that's box office math. Fans showed up where their interest already lived.
What made this section of the debate particularly uncomfortable is that executives already know all of this. Ratings data isn't hidden, merchandise reports aren't a mystery, social engagement metrics update in real time. So when fans saw companies doubling down on narratives that weren't reflected in consumer behavior, it stopped feeling like optimism and started feeling like resistance to reality. At this point, the conversation online wasn't about talent. It wasn't even about fairness. It became about return on investment, about whether brands were making decisions based on what people actually watch and buy, or based on what they wish people would support. And once that question surfaced, it reframed every partnership announcement that came before it. Because if viewership exposes attention, merchandise exposes commitment. And that's where this discussion was headed next. If viewership shows who people are willing to watch, merchandise shows who they're willing to pay for. And when fans started looking at what was actually moving off shelves, the gap between marketing narratives and consumer behavior became even harder to ignore. Because buying something is a commitment. It's money changing hands. No hashtags, no hype cycles, just a decision. This is where Caitlin Clark became the unavoidable reference point. Nearly every major product tied to her name triggered the same reaction: immediate sellouts. Her signature basketball became one of the fastest-selling items Wilson Sporting Goods had ever released. Her signature shoe drop disappeared within minutes. Collectibles tied to her image, figures, apparel, limited editions, weren't slowly adopted over time. They were gone, quickly, consistently, across categories. Fans didn't need spreadsheets to understand what that meant. That kind of response doesn't come from clever advertising alone. It comes from organic connection, from a fan base that already feels invested before the product even exists. The demand was waiting. It didn't need to be manufactured or coached into place. Brands simply met it where it already was. Now contrast that with the uncertainty surrounding other high-profile launches. There was no wave of viral sellout screenshots, no crash the website headlines. Instead, there was anticipation without confirmation, announcements without proof of uptake. And while some fans hoped those products would succeed, others quietly wondered why companies were rolling out signature lines before the demand was clearly established. That's where speculation re-entered the conversation, not in a conspiratorial way, but a practical one. Some fans suggested these brands weren't responding to existing consumer behavior. They were trying to shape it in advance, betting on future popularity instead of capitalizing on present momentum. That's a risky strategy in any market, especially one where attention patterns are already visible and documented. What made this feel more frustrating than mysterious was how predictable it all seemed. Fans pointed out that merchandise doesn't lie the way press releases can. You either sell through inventory or you don't. Warehouses either empty or they don't. And when certain names consistently move product while others struggle to generate the same urgency, it raises questions about why investment levels don't reflect that reality. This wasn't about denying anyone's talent. Most fans were careful to separate performance from commercial impact. You can be an elite player and still not convert that excellence into mass market demand. The problem wasn't ability, it was alignment. Brands appeared to be positioning athletes as commercial equals before the market had ever agreed. And once that realization spread, the debate shifted again. Because if companies were willing to ignore clear signals from buyers, and maybe these decisions weren't about business fundamentals at all. Maybe they were about something else entirely, something that prioritized perception over payoff. And that's when people started asking whether these brands were chasing numbers or running from them. By this point, the conversation had moved far beyond jerseys and color palettes. Fans weren't just reacting anymore. They were trying to make sense of a pattern. And the question that kept surfacing was simple but uncomfortable. Were these brands making decisions based on results or how those decisions look? Online, a theory began to take shape, not as a hard accusation, but as a growing suspicion. People started suggesting that some companies weren't chasing proven demand at all. They were chasing alignment with a certain image of progress, alignment with narratives they believed should resonate even if the data hadn't caught up yet. In other words, the strategy felt less like following the market and more like trying to lead it by force. That distinction matters. Betting on outcomes means you let consumer behavior guide your investment. You respond to what people watch, buy, and talk about without being prompted. Betting on optics means you commit first, loudly and publicly, and hope the audience follows. And fans began pointing out that when those two approaches collide, it's usually the audience that decides which one survives.
What made this especially noticeable was how cautious the execution actually looked beneath the big announcements. Splashy partnerships on the surface, but limited distribution behind the scenes. Signature logos that felt rushed. Campaigns that checked boxes without going all in. To some observers, it looked like brands wanted the credit for bold support without the risk of fully committing resources where returns weren't guaranteed. And again, this wasn't framed as insider knowledge. It was framed as pattern recognition. People noted how the language around these deals felt bigger than the follow-through, how confidence in press releases wasn't always matched by confidence in placement, rollout, or long-term backing. The result was a strange middle ground, too big to call experimental, too restrained to feel decisive. This is where the shareholder angle quietly entered the chat. Fans started pointing out that large corporations don't operate on vibes. They answer to boards, forecasts, and quarterly expectations, which made the disconnect even more puzzling. If the numbers were clearly favoring one kind of investment, why were resources being funneled elsewhere? Why gamble on perception when evidence was readily available? Some suggested the answer was simple. Brands were prioritizing short-term praise over long-term performance. It looks good to be early. It looks good to be loud. It looks good to appear visionary, but none of that guarantees return. And when the applause fades, only the sales numbers remain. The irony is that this approach can backfire on everyone involved. Brands take losses, consumers feel talked down to, and the athletes positioned as the next big thing end up carrying expectations shaped more by marketing than by reality. That's a heavy burden, and one that rarely produces the outcome companies claim to want. By now, it was clear this wasn't just a branding debate, it was a business one. And buried in the middle of it all was a player whose talent was never in question, but whose commercial positioning might have been. Which led fans to confront the part of this story no one seemed eager to say out loud. Here's where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because this is the point where clarity risks being mistaken for criticism. None of what sparked this backlash was about questioning skill. Paige Bueckers is an elite player. That's never been in dispute. Her resume is real. Her impact on the court is measurable. Her role in championship-level success speaks for itself. Fans who raised concerns weren't doing it to diminish her ability. They were reacting to the way corporations chose to frame and package it. What people were really responding to was the disconnect between authenticity and presentation. When branding feels rushed, borrowed, or overly comparative, it doesn't just confuse consumers, it puts the athlete in a difficult position. Instead of building an identity around her unique strengths, the marketing leans on association, and that creates expectations she never asked for and shouldn't have to carry. Being compared to a cultural phenomenon is flattering until it becomes the foundation of your commercial value. That's the part nobody likes to admit. Forced elevation can quietly do more harm than good. When brands signal confidence without fully committing, the burden shifts onto the athlete to prove the narrative correct. Every rating becomes a referendum. Every sales number becomes ammunition. Instead of allowing growth to happen naturally, the timeline accelerates and patience disappears. Fans also pointed out how hollow that can feel from the outside. When companies invest half-heartedly, minimal rollouts, conservative distribution, generic designs, it suggests the belief isn't as strong as the headlines imply. That doesn't just reflect poorly on the brand, it risks making the athlete look like the gamble, even when the real uncertainty lives higher up the chain. What Bueckers deserves, many argued, is the same thing any elite player deserves. Partners who believe deeply enough to build with her, not around someone else's shadow. Branding rooted in her story. Campaigns that highlight what makes her different, not comparable. Creative that feels intentional instead of opportunistic. That kind of investment doesn't rely on shortcuts because it doesn't need them. Instead, what fans felt they were watching was a mismatch of confidence levels. Loud messaging paired with restrained execution. Praise without patience. Visibility without infrastructure. And that combination rarely leads to long-term success. It creates pressure without support, and that benefits no one. This is where sympathy enters the conversation, even among critics of corporate strategy, because athletes aren't the ones deciding color palettes or rollout schedules. They don't choose which narratives get amplified or which comparisons get recycled. Yet they're the ones who live with the fallout when expectations crash into reality. And once you see it that way, the story stops being about rivalry or branding at all. It becomes about how businesses treat talent when numbers don't line up with vision. And it leaves one final question hanging in the air, one that brings everything full circle. At the end of all the debates, breakdowns, and brand statements, one truth keeps cutting through the noise. The market doesn't care about intention. It doesn't reward optimism on its own. It doesn't move because a narrative sounds good in a boardroom. It responds to behavior, to attention, to demand. And eventually, it makes itself heard, whether companies are ready for that message or not.
What happened here wasn't a failure of talent or effort on the court. It was a collision between storytelling and reality, between what brands wanted to be true and what consumers consistently showed them through viewership, purchases, and presence. When corporations try to jump ahead of that process, when they invest as if the outcome is guaranteed before the audience has bought in, the disconnect becomes impossible to hide. The irony is that genuine momentum can't be forced, but it can be supported when it exists. The examples are already there for anyone willing to look. When investment aligns with organic demand, products don't need excuses. They don't need borrowed symbolism or familiar shortcuts. They succeed because people were already waiting for them. That's not marketing magic, that's market literacy. What frustrated so many fans wasn't ambition, it was denial. Denial of clear signals, denial of basic business fundamentals, and denial of the idea that audiences, not executives, decide what becomes mainstream. When companies ignore that reality, they don't reshape the market, they fight it, and history shows how that usually ends. The most telling part of this entire situation is how predictable it feels in hindsight. Big announcements, careful language, limited follow-through, then surprise when results don't match expectations. It's a cycle that repeats across industries, not just sports. The only difference here is that the data is public and fans are savvy enough to read it. Eventually, every brand has to make a choice. Adjust to what people are actually supporting or keep betting on what they believe should work. One path leads to growth, the other leads to clearance racks, quiet backtracking, and explanations no one asked for. The market is patient, but it's never silent forever. And that's the real takeaway, because hype fades, narratives shift, but numbers linger, and in the end, they always tell the story the headlines tried to avoid.